Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a slightly different video. We're going to do some Premier League and FPL predictions. These are more season-long predictions. I thought it would be a little bit fun at the stage we're at in the preseason, where a lot of people, I think, are set on a certain draft structure. 2 to 3 to 4 changes might change. We might have some preseason hidden gems crop up, like a Daniel Malin, but it's also just sort of, not too much information is left. The only thing that would probably change the league in terms of the Premier League positions fundamentally would be Isak moving towards Liverpool, which I think is still likely to happen, if I'm honest, despite the reporting suggesting that Liverpool have sort of paused with their bids. But from an FPL point of view, I think that doesn't change too much, if I'm honest, when it comes to my assessment of, let's say, a Mo Salah, for example, and what that means for some of the other Liverpool assets, other than maybe knock on reduced minutes for certain players. What I will say, though, in terms of Premier League predictions is I've never done this before. I do tend to take a very data-minded approach, but I think I also follow and watch a lot of the sort of big five leagues anyways within Europe. And I'm pretty clued into all the signings, watch as much football as I can on the weekends for the Premier League. So feel pretty comfortable doing the predictions and just having a little bit of fun. So getting started, doing a almost 20-1 predicted points table is what I'm going to do. I'm not actually going to predict the points, but we're just going to run through the league table starting from the bottom. And I think starting from the bottom, you've probably got to look at the 3 relegated teams or projected to be relegated teams. And I still think, unfortunately, I'd have to bucket Leeds into this. I think they're a wide margin away from, let's say, a Sunderland, Burnley. And they're definitely the team that, even from a data perspective, I think a lot of people who are clued into it would suggest that Leeds might be the first team within the last 3 or 4 seasons that would actually buck the trend of actually a promoted team struggling to actually make it out of the Premier League season and sort of avoiding relegation. So I would say Leeds is definitely going to be my 18th place team. And then if I work my way down, it's about 19 and 20, where the big difference between, I think, Sunderland and Burnley is last season, if you just look at performance, Burnley clearly did massive overperformance when it came to conceding goals. I think a lot of people mentioned, the 16 goals that they conceded was definitely overperformance. But at the same time, I think you still have to respect that actually when you look at the underlying stats, that they were still the second best team when it comes to defensive numbers, on expected defensive numbers. So I think Burnley were very comfortably the second best team in the Championship last season. And that's no surprise given the sort of points tally that they have. But I think I'm taking into account the overperformance, expecting them to not do it again, and still thinking that they were a better team than, let's say, a Sunderland. But Sunderland have spent actually a lot of money this season. They've spent a little bit of money sort of recruiting players that they've already had, like, let's say, Enzo Lefebvre, who played for them last season on loan. They've also spent a lot of money on, let's say, new signings like Granit Xhaka, for example, who's clearly on a sizable contract. And then some other signings like Adingra have been quite massive, where Adingra is a player that we've probably seen in the past, especially more so under De Zerbi, where he could play very consistent minutes in the Premier League and looked like a very sort of top, maybe like middle table winger. And he's now joined a team like Sunderland, where they've reinforced a lot. And Burnley, I think, conversely, probably haven't spent as much, but then we're already maybe a little bit of ways ahead of Sunderland. What I would probably say is I'd still feel quite comfortable that sort of base of Burnley being a slightly better defensive team is actually going to be quite helpful in terms of them securing 19th here. Unfortunately, I did do a little bit of analysis in terms of teams who actually avoided relegation in the past, and the general trend we actually saw was that teams that were a little bit more tilted towards defense and a little bit worse on offense were actually better performing than teams who had the opposite traits. So I'm kind of going to back the defensive team here in Burnley and pick Burnley as my 19th place team. And then unfortunately, I've got Sunderland in my 20th place. Now, if these teams overperform, I think that's fine. I wouldn't expect Burnley and Sunderland to come out of the Premier League, to be honest, this season. But I think Leeds probably have the best chance of actually not getting relegated. So I wouldn't be surprised to actually see them finish, in the bottom half, but then actually outside of a relegation spot. So let's move on to the other spots, which would be 17th to, let's say, that range of 15th. I think these 3 teams is interesting because a lot of people tend to have very, very different teams in this bracket, but everyone seems to have Wolves back here. And it's interesting because the context last season was we had another Gary O'Neill season that was pretty bad, and then another manager came in, this time mid-season, and he very much sort of rectified or improved the team almost instantaneously, right? For Iraola, it took almost 6 to 7 weeks. I think Pereira had some sort of slow results, but then actually the team very much went firing. And then Wolves were actually even at one point in time about to set some records with consecutive wins. They just haven't spent too much money in terms of reinforcing some of the key kind of players that they've lost. And, they've just signed a left back from Norway, who I believe should be quite good. But when you compare to, let's say, Nuri or let's say Cunha leaving, I don't think we necessarily have been able to sort of rectify that within the team. So that is kind of my major concern. And then there's also an aspect to the squad where there's a pretty decent amount of, let's say, aging. They have signed John Arias though, so that's almost their Cunha replacement. He's more of a right winger type, and of course things will change around the team. But Hugo Bueno as well is coming back, and I just think that Wolves is probably the team still when I look at, let's say, how weak the defense is on paper compared to some of the other teams here lower on, and despite Pereira being a very good defensive manager, I can't really see them pushing anywhere beyond, let's say, 16th and 17th. So I'm going to put Wolves here at 17th. And part of this, as I said, is you're losing two key players who are critical towards your attack and build up as well. I think Cunha, most of us last season saw that he was a game changer, just in the fact that he can create something out of nothing. When you actually look at, let's say, Wolves' underlying stats from last season, I don't think they were particularly that impressive either way, right? It was mostly the defense that I think I was generally quite impressed with, especially under Pereira. They still, when you look at the season-long numbers, were very close with West Ham in being the two worst teams outside of your Ipswiches, your Leicesters, and your Southampton. So basically what I'm saying is, even though I think Pereira was good, you've lost two key players, and you might have replaced them with slightly worse players, so I can't really see yourself being too much better. So unfortunately, I've got Wolves here in this position right now, and they'll be my 17th place team. In terms of my 16th, a lot of people tend to actually have West Ham in this sort of bucket, and I can kind of see it. We're looking at the preseason now, and actually Paqueta's suspension is sort of revoked. They have signed a left back that's quite good. Kilman, I think, we're very comfortable as a center back, and then the question sometimes is going to be whether they play a back three or a back two. But they do have a little bit more depth there, and even Agard, for example, is staying within this team. And Wan-Bissaka obviously has improved a lot as a player. I'd probably still think that the midfield's very, very weak. There's a couple teams in this sort of bottom half that really have, a really poor midfield. Man United were a team that finished in the bottom half last season, and they still have a very poor midfield. But I think a lot of people are expecting them to kick on because, of course, of the tremendous improvement in terms of the attacking phase. I would actually probably like to put Everton as my team here in 16th. I just think that there isn't too much wing depth right now for the team. I'm not sure if I'm totally in love with the fullbacks as they stand. They have a couple young players, like, for example, Patterson as well, who can come into the team and probably continue to develop as a player. We've seen O'Brien play out wide, especially under Moyes, and he's looked really good. So that's nice. And they obviously have strong pieces like Agea, but they've lost Doucouré, and now they're expecting to play Alvarez almost in that 10 position. NDI will most likely be their left mid. They are, in search for someone like Malik Fofana, but haven't signed him, and I don't think they will. And then up top, they've actually reinforced with Barry. So a slight improvement, I suppose, over Dominic Calvert-Lewin, who really struggled with availability as well. Potter and Moyes are actually both very good managers, right? Both managers who have had really good, consistent campaigns. I just think that they have weak squads, at their behest. And so I think it's really either or. I will probably actually have Everton as my 16th place team, and then I'll have West Ham as my 15th place team. I don't think there's much to separate these teams, though. And then between 14th to 12th, I think the interesting thing here is that I think there's a huge gap in this point where between, let's say, West Ham and Everton and the rest of the teams, I think there's a little bit of a gap here. I think Forest, and I know this will shock people, but I will have Forest here. I think they've sold some key players. They've signed some good ones like Ndoye, Igor Jesus, so that's going to improve their attack, but they've lost Elanga, of course, crucially. Gibbs White is still there, and I think that's really helpful to the team. The defense is really solid, but I think the midfield is still a little bit weak. Like, the sort of defensive mid position has never really been figured out. I think Sangare has struggled within the league, as much as sort of people have been waxing lyrical about him for what feels like almost a decade now. And then I suppose they have a bit more depth for Wood, and he's just, consistent as a rock. And I don't think there's much to be said about that. But when you actually look at their underlying performance last season, I think Forest were actually one of the teams that were already performing within a bracket, kind of, at that 14th, 15th league position basis. They were quite fortunate at the start of the season, I think, to get the amount of cleans that they did. They won a lot of games in your kind of classic Serie A style of 1-0s, etc. And maybe just keeping a few too many cleans that they should have at the start. And then everything kind of went downhill at the second half of the season, where they just dropped a lot of points. And so they finished 7th, I believe, last season. But I actually still think that they performed like a bottom half team for the most part. And that's kind of my expectation almost, that they're going to not be much better than they were last season. And a lot of the teams around, let's say a United last season or a Tottenham last season, they would have kicked on a little bit. And so that's kind of why I think Forest will sort of be where they're at. Now, interestingly, a lot of people think Brentford are one of the teams that I must have already mentioned at this point, and that's why I'm going to mention them now. I think Brentford's going to be my 13th place team. I think, yes, of course, Brentford have had some massive outgoings, and they still have one more massive outgoing to come, which is most likely Wiesa to depart the club, and then Mbemo, who has already left. I think Sade developing the way that he had last season was massive, and I think some people are probably going to forget how amazing of a season he had actually in open play. I mean, he scored 11 goals. You still have a lot of production there. Yarmouk is going to be another young player who's going to kick on. I think the defense that they have is actually much better than most of the defenses that I've already mentioned previously, outside of maybe a Forest or an Everton, who are definitely kind of more tilted towards defense and actually have, like, let's say, a good defensive team. Like, when I look at Forest, they have a really good back four that I like. I would say the same about Everton center backs, but not necessarily the full backs. So actually, Brentford have almost a back four that I really do like. And then they have a lot of players who are quite versatile, right? Like, let's say your Lewis Potters of the world, he can kind of play almost out wide at times, but he's also been sort of shackled into playing fullback. Coyote, of course, is a really good player who I think will just be really, really solid at that sort of right back position. And they have really good center back depth, despite, for example, like someone like Ben Mee, who's been completely phased out of the team, really, right? You've got more than enough depth there. So I really do actually like Brentford. I think Ior Jesus is not good enough, but it seems like they're going to spend more money on other players. They've also crucially signed Milambo, who's a center mid /10, who I think will do really well. Damsgaard also had a huge breakout season last year in a creative role, but then also a role where he played a very balanced team. So when I was looking at the list of almost all the players who actually committed a lot of defensive contributions, Damsgaard was actually surprisingly high up there. And it just shows you how much he sort of relied on to sort of do a lot of the tactical things for Brentford as well. And then in terms of, replacing Mbeumo, you can't do that. But a lot of the goals that Mbeumo scored last season were also penalties. So I think that's a point that might be missed in terms of how bad Brentford are without him. Clearly, Wiesa leaving will probably prompt another transfer for this team. So that's kind of what I'm expecting, right? You're going to lose Wiesa, who's obviously going to be a big miss. He is almost at the peak of his powers, and you're losing a player at his prime years at 28 in Wiesa, but they must definitely be signing someone else. And that's kind of what I'm expecting here, to be able to say that Brentford is going to be my team here at that spot, right above Forest at 13th. So that's kind of what I have right now. It's a little bit unfortunate where I think some people are probably going to looking at this list and thinking that it makes no sense having Brentford here. A lot of other teams probably haven't lost the same amount of key players. But I think Brentford also, we have to kind of remind ourselves, we're actually a team that performed really well in terms of underlyings last year, and we're quite comfortably 10th, right? In previous seasons, we've also seen them be around that sort of 8th to 10th range. I think they were very much within touching distance of that. And then actually the core of their team, when it comes to, let's say, the defensive piece, the midfield piece, and of course, yes, they have lost Norgard as well, but it's about these sort of other key players who are now a firm part of their starting 11, like a Yarmouk, who's like 21. These kind of players are strong. Vandenberg, for example, who was signed and now is an extremely high quality depth piece. Are they going to kick on? And then I suppose maybe I'm overshooting a little bit on how good Milambo could be, but as a 20-year-old, I think he's a good signing, and maybe part of that is because I play a lot of Football Manager and sort of expect him to do good. But yeah, I've always had a lot of faith in Brentford as a team. The biggest thing about Brentford is always going to be the managerial piece, where of course signing a set piece coach to be a Premier League manager for the very first time in his full-on managerial role is going to be a big question mark. But if there's ever a club, more from a data perspective, that I think is going to do well and make weird decisions that obviously look really poor with foresight, but then actually look good in hindsight, I think that's Brentford. So I'd have to give them some credit there, and I'll have Brentford at 13th. After that, it's quite interesting because, look, I haven't mentioned the Spurs and a United, and these were teams that performed really poorly last season, but they have, had a lot of changes, right? Spurs, you have Thomas Frank there. You have, once again, a pretty young squad, I think, that will kick on, right? There are players like Bergvall who will improve, but the club that I probably haven't mentioned that finished actually in a really good position last season when it comes to the underlyings is Crystal Palace, where one of my concerns for Crystal Palace is they haven't really come close to signing anyone. They probably have one of the weakest depths of any teams that are available, and I think their manager Glasner has already spoken to it. So I kind of want to put Crystal Palace here because I think they just haven't spent, enough money whatsoever in terms of improving the team. But there's also a team like Fulham where I haven't mentioned them already. And I actually think that, let's say, Fulham is probably still worse off than a Crystal Palace. They actually have a much more aged squad compared to Crystal Palace. The biggest thing with Crystal Palace that I think will definitely move the needles is where's Eze going to go? That release clause, I believe, has already expired. So maybe that actually leads to a higher chance of Eze actually staying within the club. So I feel a little bit confident right now in actually putting Fulham in that 12th place spot. And then actually having Crystal Palace in that 11th place spot. And then, we kind of have to talk about teams like United and Spurs very, very shortly, or even Bournemouth, for example. But that's kind of where I'm going to have Crystal Palace. And this is an interesting thing with Crystal Palace, where I'd say they actually, to me, probably have, let's say, a top 5 manager in the league. But do they have a top 5 squad in the league? And I'm not quite sure, right? If any, all the news that we kind of hear from Crystal Palace is that they're more than likely going to sell a couple more players as opposed to sign more players. And so they're kind of in that position that Wolves are at, where if they were to lose a couple players but then sign a couple new players, they're not really improving the team whatsoever. And so I don't really have a huge basis to say that Crystal Palace will improve the season compared to last, whereas all the other teams around them are most likely going to have either younger squads that will just get better, or they've signed a lot more players and have much more depth to be able to compete on multiple fronts, because Crystal Palace will still be involved within a European campaign. And I think what we tend to see with a lot of teams involved in European campaign is that it has knock-on effects. Like Newcastle, the first time round that they had Champions League, we saw them suffer a lot. And so I'm kind of expecting that to also hurt Crystal Palace a bit, which is why I have Crystal Palace now at 11th. After that, we start to talk about, as I said, teams like United and Spurs, but then there's also teams like Brighton and Bournemouth who were playing really well last season, who were under a new manager within the case of Brighton, and then obviously having a second season. Huge leap, I think, with Iraola as well, right? Where Bournemouth, on the underlying numbers, were probably a top 7 team within the Premier League, and they actually ended up finishing at 9th. And part of this was because they had a huge skid near the end. A lot of that, I think, prompted by a lot of injuries. We saw a lot of players go down. We saw, for example, Evan Nilsson out for a while, where they actually managed to get a lot of good results because they played Dango Ouattara up top. But for large stints of the season, they didn't actually have much of Tavernier. They didn't really play with the right back for most of the season. They've also sold a lot of players. And so I do want to put Bournemouth in this sort of spot here right now, which is going to be that 10th place spot, because I think they've lost a lot of players. It seems like, once again, they're going to lose potentially someone like Zabarnyi, but they have Senesi waiting in the wings to almost cover what Huijsen would have been doing this season for this team. In left back, they've signed a new player. I can't say I'm extremely into what Schuffer produces, but I think Kirk, as we saw, was a tremendous player last season, and no surprise he's gone to Liverpool, but that has to be a downgrade in some ways. And in the right back position, they of course have Araujo and sometimes, some makeshift sort of center mids who actually play in the right back position. But that's kind of my concern. I think the defense is quite weak on paper. I really do like the goalkeeper signing in Petrovic. Has the midfield really improved too much? Not really. Christie's expected to play quite a few minutes because of the injuries that they have presently. Alex Scott, who's really struggled to sort of, I think, stay fit out of his sort of breakout championship campaign, should be kicking on. They've also signed Junior Krupi, but he's most likely going to be a future signing where you're going to see the best of him, in 2-3 years at the bare minimum, as opposed to now where he's just come out of League 2 from the French league, second division, and isn't likely to play a huge part in terms of the Premier League campaign. So Evan Nilsson's going to be a great player. I think he already showed that he was definitely Premier League ready and really good. Semenyo's probably their best player. He's actually sort of topped up his contract. Kluivert, we actually saw, was linked with some other clubs, but it seems like that's sort of died down a little bit now. So I think he's most likely going to kick on and play well. And they actually have some pretty decent depth, like with Tavernier. So that's kind of why I think I put Bournemouth here. I still think that they struggle with depth. I still think that they've lost a couple players on defense that they can't really rectify. Like you can't really legislate for, I think, Huijsen leaving, because he was actually already borderline world class at his sort of freakish young age. And you're just not going to be able to sort of spend 50 million in the market to be able to get that sort of player who's happy to play for Bournemouth. And I think that's the unfortunate part of the thing, but they've already done such a great job in terms of making money so shortly within that deal. And I guess, making the most out of Huijsen last season. So that's kind of where I have Bournemouth. Then I think the question is, do I think a team like Brighton is going to get better? They did lose João Pedro, but we've had such a consistent faith in a lot of the players that they've signed. Their squad is young. They have a good manager as well. very much the same sort of tools as Bournemouth, but probably have actually, I would still say right now, a little bit more depth that they're comfortable with having in all sorts of positions. They've just signed a Kuiper as well within the left back position. And yeah, I actually think Brighton are better than these two teams. And one of the things that, let's say, Tottenham will have to deal with is going to be this sort of impact of European football. So I think that's going to hurt Tottenham the most. I don't think Son leaving is going to have a huge impact on Tottenham, if I'm being completely honest. I watched Son a lot last season. I even owned Son a lot last season. I do think it's a time for him to leave, as opposed to, let's say, play reduced minutes this season and sort of not have the role that he would have wanted to have as the captain of the team. And it kind of makes sense that Son's leaving, which was also extremely sad, by the way, watching the Tottenham versus Newcastle game, watching the Guard of Honor, watching the stadium react to him, and watching him sort of just realize, I guess, obviously the years of service to the club and just, what the whole ride has meant for him. So that's sad, but, I'm doing a Premier League prediction here. I'm just looking at the quality of the squad with Tottenham. And I think they will still struggle with Champions League. I still think that they haven't had enough signings. We've seen Madison unfortunately succumb to what seems like an ACL injury. So I'm just going to put Tottenham here. I do think Thomas Frank is going to improve the team. I can't see him letting this team have the same sort of quality of league performance as they did last year. So I'm just going to put them there. Then I'm going to put United right here in this position next on 8th. So basically Tottenham and United, this is a really vast improvement from last season. United, I mean, fair enough. They've signed a lot of good players like Cunha and Burma, great signings. I think Dorgu's just a really good addition to the left wing back position. The ability to now sort of flexibly play between Amad Diallo and Dallo is really nice in the right wing back position. And Diallo can obviously play minutes within attacking positions as well. So you just generally have much more depth there without even thinking about Garnacho and, of course, Rashford, who's left on loan. Højlund, of course, isn't great, but then I think Bruno's always there. The midfield, to me, is the worst part of the midfield, or rather the worst part of the squad, because I think at the centre-back positions, I really, really do like Lenny Yoro, but it's still, a back three, and I'm not super confident in a lot of the players here. So I think the United squad quality is okay, and it's improved a lot, especially in terms of attack, but there are still some big pieces that they're struggling to get rid of. Will they make another big signing is probably another big question to ask. But part of that, I think, is only going to be prompted by outgoings. And I can't really see them successfully bidding off a lot of players that they've sort of devalued themselves through Amorim last season. So I think putting United at 8th is fair here. I would feel a bit sad to sort of not have put Bournemouth over United and Tottenham, because I feel like Bournemouth is so much more of a well-run club. But I just think that the Bournemouth team is a little bit weak in terms of squad quality, which is kind of why, despite their sort of tremendous overperformance last season, I'm not really sure they can still sort of replicate that, because I think the base of Bournemouth has gotten a lot worse, and I am actually expecting Zabarnyi to leave. Maybe if Zabarnyi doesn't leave, then, there's a little bit of a different case here, and maybe I've gotten in the wrong position in terms of Bournemouth. But I think one of the things that is kind of sad is like a team like United and Tottenham, or teams like United and Tottenham, have spent a lot more money, and they've actually definitely improved. And I think it's hard to almost go against that logic, whereas some of the teams that have been super well run just haven't been able to sort of bring in the same quality of players. And that's kind of why I feel like there's improvement there. But I could be wrong about as to, let's say, how much improvement United and Tottenham have been able to make. After this, though, I have Aston Villa as my 6th place team. Now, it's an interesting case on Aston Villa, because I don't think they were particularly amazing last season when it came to these sort of underlying stats. But do they just generally have a good squad, have a good manager, have a really good core of a team, minus a good right back? I think that's very much so the case. Like, I think when you look at Dean and Maatsen, that's a really good left back depth. The center back depth is reasonably strong, as long as, let's say, Pau Torres is alive or Mings is alive, which doesn't actually happen very often. Consa's great. Martinez is great. The midfield, I think, is extremely solid. They have depth now in different places in the midfield. And then Tielemans is just someone who we previously didn't see was able to sort of play 35 to 38 full minutes within the Premier League, and actually just, put out consistently good performances, whether it was more sort of a deep lying playmakers type setup, or even at times where he was even asked to play like a 10. I think Rodgers is going to kick on within this year. They haven't signed too many attacking sort of wing depth players, and I think that's kind of the concern, because last season, I think what made them struggle was being involved in the Champions League at the same time as trying to also continue to fight for maintaining, let's say, a UCL spot within the Premier League campaign. Really did mean that they needed a lot of the sort of winter depth that they actually added, like a Rashford, like an Asensio, and they don't really have that right now in terms of permanent signings. But they still have had players who, like Buendia or maybe a Leon Bailey, who maybe could kick on this season. These are both players who have been injured for very much the last 2 seasons, and I don't expect to play, significant roles, but that's kind of where I'm at. Ramsey's still within the team, but of course he seems like also positioned for an exit. So that's the weird thing with Villa, where I think I can't really say that they've improved too much. They've overperformed a little bit under Emery, but they are just almost a beacon of consistency, and I kind of feel like they're just going to finish exactly where they're going to do. And that also means that I'm going to put Brighton at 7th. Brighton are a team that I think are pretty exceptional in the sense that when you look at their team, all the players who play for the starting 11 are still below peak age. And I think that just means on paper that that type of squad is just going to improve, to the next season. Who am I sort of talking about in this case, right? Verbruggen, for example, who's obviously injured now, but is basically going to get a year along. Van Heck, who's 24, who was really, really good last season. The defense at points was pretty awful, right? Like Dunk, Webster, I don't think we have a lot of faith in them, but they've actually signed new players like Boscaglia, for example, that I really like. The Kuiper that I really like. Not that he's a really defensive player, but he's going to be asked to sort of play almost a left back role. And I think that will be quite a big transitional shift for him, right? I can't necessarily see Brighton sort of playing a 3-back, but maybe they will going forwards. I think they're still very much a team that enjoys being in that mold of, let's say, being a 4-3-3. So that's kind of what I think is going to be a bit of a struggling point for this team. But there are a lot of players, as I said, that are still continuously peaking, right? Which is the likes of Baleba, the likes of Minte, who's very young, even Hinshelwood, for example, who's like a depth piece who can be played everywhere. And then they have some aging veteran players like a Dunk and Welbeck, who I'm not expecting too much out of. Like Dunk was actually awful last season, so I'm really not going to talk too much about him. But Welbeck is someone who actually had his, I think, Premier League best sort of scoring tally with 10 last season. Do I expect him to do that this season? Not really. I think I'd probably expect him to undershoot that. But Mitoma is still, below 28, around 28, should have another great season once again. And they have lost someone like João Pedro, but then you would expect someone like Jorginho Rutter to be able to kind of kick on in here in this case, and other players like Riley to play more minutes, and Weaver, for example, across the board. So I do really like Brighton. I think I've generally got faith in them. Kadioglu will be coming back into the team as well. Some of the players who actually went on various loans will also be coming back into the team. So I just generally have the faith that Brighton will almost sort of reproduce last season's performance and then maybe just perform slightly better, which then shoots them to 7th. And then Aston Villa I have at 6th. And then I think the top 5, it seems like a lot of people have a consensus on the top 5. I would put Newcastle straight into 5th. Part of this is because I think the teams above Newcastle are just so good. I think there's a huge gap between what is a lot of the teams and Newcastle, below Newcastle, and then I think there's an even larger gap in terms of quality within the Premier League between teams that are Newcastle and then everything else. My other concern with Newcastle, I think generally speaking, is just depth, right? I think the depth is really poor. They're still expected to sign another player. I am still expecting them to lose Isak, which probably actually might even mean that they could actually drop to 6th in this ranking. I already mentioned at the start of this video how I think whenever a team sort of steps back in the Champions League, if they don't have enough depth, they're definitely going to struggle within the league season. Newcastle were basically the poster boys for that 2 seasons ago, and now I'm predicting them to finish 5th, which might be just overestimating how good they are. But when I look at the midfield, I think the depth being Lewis Miley is really nice, but then it's also, is that enough? In defense, you also have issues like Botman's been struggling with injuries almost the last 2 seasons now, back to back. And now you also have key players to the team once again adding another +1 on their age, which would be the likes of Burn and Shar, who are quite old, and even Trippier. Lewis Hall is back. I just saw within the Tottenham game, so that's fantastic. So is Livramento, who doesn't seem like he's actually going to leave towards City. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But I think right now Newcastle actually have an extremely strong team in terms of the starting 11, even if Isak was to leave, especially now that you've got Elanga, who can play right wing and at least provide some depth alongside Murphy. So because the core of the midfield is so good, like that midfield trio, I think some people might even hold that as the best midfield in the league outside of, let's say, maybe Liverpool's or Arsenal's. City would probably also have a claim to that as soon as they get Rodri back and he's fully fit, but he's not going to start this season fully fit, because I was watching the Club World Cup and he's not close, right? And why would we expect that from a player who unfortunately only had an ACL injury last season? With Chelsea as well, they also have another claim to the best midfield. So these teams all have the claim to sort of best midfields in the league, and I think that is quite quintessential to sort of keeping the motor running for the season long. Newcastle probably have the worst attacking depth out of anyone in the top 5, so I think it's very easy to put Newcastle here, but it's more interesting to actually predict whether Chelsea is going to have a huge leap once again as a team, because they only finished 4th last season, and I think they finished 4th last season actually only 2 points below City. So in the context of that, I think a lot of people are going to expect that there's not too much of a gap to be made. But City have also made a lot of signings, and they're still under Pep Guardiola. They now have Rodri back. And these are the kind of questions to be asked where can Chelsea actually kick on and actually match towards the level of a Liverpool, Arsenal, and City? Looking at kind of, betting markets and even sort of models and things like that, I think it's unlikely that a team like, let's say, Chelsea's gonna push on, because I think when I look at the wing depth, that's still a position where I don't think the mature wingers are actually as good as some of the other competing teams in the league. Their strength is in the midfield. Their strength is in sort of the defensive pieces like Cucurella being as good as they are. And then generally just the way that they actually control the game right now, I think is very, very impressive, as we saw within the Club World Cup. That was a demolition of PSG. And I think we've never even seen PSG succumb like that. Like Arsenal in the second leg versus PSG, I think created a lot of chances, a lot of it through set pieces and sort of, winning second duels. But in terms of just being sort of overwhelmed on the pitch, I don't think I've seen Chelsea or any other team dominate PSG that hard in open play. So that was really impressive by Chelsea, but is that a one-off? Hard to say, but they just have so many good pieces in depth, right? João Pedro's a huge addition. They now have these young wingers who are just getting better and better. They now have midfield depth for someone like an Enzo Fernandez, for example, with Andre Santos. They have Caicedo, who's still, very, very young and continuously peaking as a player. And then they have more center back options. Like Fofana will come back into the team, maybe, but you still have Badiashile at the end of the day. And you've already signed Joel Hato to be potentially depth for Cucurella and also Colwell. What's interesting about this Chelsea team too is I think that they have slightly different setups when it comes to the fullbacks compared to some of the other teams. Like I think we're seeing City where they've gone for Aït-Nouri. That's clearly an ambition to sort of want to work more offensively, sort of within the wing areas, within, let's say, maybe even utilizing, let's say, the best out of Doku by having someone like Aït-Nouri who can at times, for example, go wide and actually allow Doku to even go inside, or conversely as well, he can kind of come in and Doku can kind of push on out wide too, which is sort of Doku's main pro. And I guess the difference would have been how many touches would someone like Guardiola would have had deep inside the box compared to someone like Aït-Nouri, who's actually very comfortable actually driving at defenders, taking them on 1v1s, allowing probably other people to make runs inside and things like that. The right back position for City is actually still really, really weak. So I don't really love City from that perspective, but I think with Rodri coming back, with the central defense still being quite strong, like the core partnership is going to be Guardiola, Ruben Diaz, which I think is really good. If they play a back three, if they were able to consider moving back into that, they have enough depth, I would say, as long as they're not run down by injuries. But the core players would be Ruben Diaz and Guardiola, who are definitely less injury prone than, let's say, Akanji and Stones. So that's a bit of a benefit. And then we've got right back being an issue, but Nunez is still, I think, serviceable. But does Nunez sort of move the needle in terms of winning the league? I think absolutely not, which is why when I look at some of the other teams like Liverpool and Arsenal, I just think that they have a complete team across the board. And that means City's going to be my third place team. That also means Chelsea's going to be my fourth place team. And what I don't love about Chelsea, I suppose, is the other teams are just slightly better. I think maybe Palmer's one of the better players when you look at, let's say, the top four in terms of sort of being your best player and what that means for the team. But it's also things like, I'm not sure if the second center back within Chelsea is as good as, let's say, the center back pairs, anyways, that some of these other teams have, like, let's say, a Liverpool and Arsenal, definitely. Gusto actually looked like he played a really good role within the Club World Cup, but is he expected to continue to do that, or will there be continuously some games where he's asked to play more sort of within the midfield, which he's looked really, really poor at? That's kind of the kind of concerns that I have. And then Reece James actually almost solves a lot of issues for Chelsea, because he can sort of play right center mid at times, especially when Lavia's out, and then he can also play right back, and more so within that sort of midfield role that Maresca clearly likes. But I still think, for example, Pedro Neto is much worse as a winger compared to anyone else within the top three. I also think that you can say the same for whoever's playing on the other wing, unless you're technically counting Palmer as a winger, who I would say he's going to be more so the 10 last, like this season, but allowed to sort of operate within the right inside spaces, hopefully, which is what we want to see from the Chelsea team. But that's sort of the main difference. Whereas when I look at a City, the attacking depth is just ridiculous. The midfield has been strengthened up and beefed up by at least Reinders, who actually has a motor and can run, compared to, let's say, a Gundo, Bernardo, who are much slower and definitely much worse at sort of being able to get second balls. Coming back at some point in the season is going to be huge for this team. Rodri as well has already played a lot of football coming back, but clearly is a ways to go within sort of full fitness. So I think that's just tremendous. And then there's X factors that City still have, like Foden doing nothing this season might mean that City finishes third, but if Foden was able to sort of actually bring back that level of football that he showcased the season previous, which is just sort of outrageous finishing, a lot of confidence in terms of taking people on. I mean, who knows where City can kind of go, without even mentioning players like Marmoush and Haaland, who are, I think, going to just guarantee you a lot of goals for the season. Like, Marmoush might not play his preferred positions. He might play a variety of roles this year, but I think he will just naturally get you somewhere between 8 to 12 goals this season, because he's just that good at sort of getting to great spots. And he's that good of a ball striker as well. But yeah, that's kind of why I have City at third. I think they have just slightly more of an incomplete team. Arsenal, we just know the defensive base is just ridiculous. They are the best defense in the league by far, even though Liverpool actually got more clean sheets than them, even though I think Forest actually sort of met them for joint clean sheets. I think my expectation is that Arsenal's defense is still the best, especially just in terms of sort of the recurring game to game. How many expected goals are you conceding per match? Zubimendi's a huge upgrade. I don't even need to mention the unnamed Premier League player who's left the team. I mean, we're expecting to kick on. A lot of the squad is young. You'll still have now Havertz maybe as depth between center forward and sort of center mid positions. And now you have a little bit more wing depth without even thinking about whether Eze is going to join the team. And now you have Gyok leading the line. Now, a lot of people actually seemingly are very cool on Gyökeres. I think people more from the data space think that he's a player who's dominated the Portuguese league. We have sort of seen that before, not at the extent of domination that Gyökeres has shown, but I think there's general pessimism around him. I mean, I guess when I've watched him play, I think he's very impressive. Does he need time and space to shoot? Sure, but so do a lot of other Premier League strikers in the league who actually get really consistent tallies. Is he a good ball carrier? Yes. So I don't really have major concerns about Gyökeres, and it's also about whether he actually is going to get service centrally, right? So are there players like maybe like Rice, between Rice, Zubimendi, and Odegaard who actually can give him service? And I think maybe the question is there might not be, but I have enough confidence that Arsenal's midfield can work it out, that Odegaard can almost at least reclaim some level of performance, because he was absolutely shocking last season. But is that enough to really beat a Liverpool that has Isak? Absolutely not. So my first place team is definitely going to be Liverpool. I think that's non-controversial. Salah's going to be 1 year older, and that's a huge sort of con, but we'll have to sort of maintain that as it is. When it comes to, let's say, the amount of depth that Liverpool have been able to sort of reclaim, like, they've really improved, right? Even though they've lost some good players, like, for example, Trent, they've arguably brought someone stronger in Frimpong, at least more from a physicality perspective. They lose creativity, of course, but then they actually picked up Wirtz, and I think that already makes up for it. In the left back position, you've taken, I guess, a rotating pair of Tsimikas and Robertson, with Robertson being much worse as a player than he was, let's say, 3-4 years ago, and now brought in Kirkes, who should really kick on extremely well. You've lost Luis Diaz, but then you have Gakpo already, and then Ekitike, who could almost play a bench depth role for this team. But then, do Liverpool also try things like 4-2-4? And do I have the confidence that Slot's going to make it work? I think yes, across the board. And how much is Salah going to drop out compared to last season? I think a lot of last season, Sally's, owed to the 9 penalties that he took. But is he going to be a creative monster this season? Especially if he's going to get better players to be able to service, like, let's say, the upgrade of Isak over Darwin, or even Ekitike over Darwin? Probably. And that's all I really have to say. I think Liverpool are just too strong across the board. And even though Arsenal have actually made some pretty good signings, they haven't made the sort of same quality of signings. And I am still expecting Isak to join Liverpool. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. And that's going to be my 20-1 Premier League table. I hope that it doesn't offend too many people. First time doing it. And I think it's a fun little experiment, right? Just sort of walking through the teams in the league. There are obviously teams that, from a modeling perspective, I think I've probably overshot on. Like, I think the teams like United and Tottenham, the markets are probably higher on than let's say, people who run team strength models. I'm kind of probably in the middle between these sorts of teams. And then also, I think in terms of, let's say, the opportunity and the ability for, let's say, a Brighton or a Bournemouth or a Brentford to sort of reproduce the sort of quality of performance last season, I'm not so sure if that's really replicable. So I've got some questions there, but that's going to be my Premier League table. I'm excited to have done this, and let me know what your thoughts are in terms of how bad the takes are. But thank you guys so much for watching. See you guys soon.